The sun over Redemption Creek was a merciless eye baking the cracked earth until the dust itself seemed to shimmer with exhaustion. It was a town built on grit and whispers, where the line between law and survival was drawn in the sand each morning and blown away by the afternoon winds. Jedediah Morgan, a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape, stood on the boardwalk outside the bank, the weight of the past year pressing down on him as relentlessly as the heat. His twin daughters, Sarah and Emily, clutched his hands, their small fingers a fragile anchor in the sea of his grief. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and stale hope. Jedediah was there for a simple transaction, a withdrawal to pay his ranch hands. But the mundane task felt monumental. Every public appearance was a trial, every neighborly nod a reminder of the pity that clung to him, like a second shadow since his wife Martha had been taken by a fever. He was a man adrift, his stoicism a dam, holding back a flood of sorrow. The sudden crash of the bank's doors splintering inward shattered the sleepy afternoon calm. 3 men burst in bandanas, pulled high over their faces, their movements practiced and brutal. The leader, a tall man with eyes that glinted with a cold, charismatic fire, held 2 pistols with an artist's familiarity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice a smooth, confident baritone that cut through the rising panic. "This is a redistribution of wealth. Please cooperate, and you may live to see sundown." Chaos erupted. A woman screamed. The teller's hands shot into the air. Jedediah's first instinct was his daughters. He shoved them behind him, his body a shield, his mind racing. But as one of the robbers began stuffing cash into a canvas sack, the leader's eyes found Jedediah's. There was a flicker of recognition, a predatory gleam that made the hairs on Jedediah's neck stand on end. This was not random. The man strode directly toward him, ignoring the money, ignoring the other frozen patrons. He stopped just inches away, the barrel of his pistol coolly tapping Jedediah's chest. "A fine-looking family, Mr. Morgan," he said, his voice low and laced with an unnerving intimacy. "A man ought to be careful what he holds dear." He didn't reach for Jedediah's wallet. Instead, his gloved fingers deftly hooked the silver chain around Jedediah's neck. The locket, cool against his skin, moments before, was suddenly a point of burning focus. It held a miniature portrait of Martha, her smile a ghost he clung to in the long, silent nights. "No," Jedediah growled, a primal sound of defiance. He lunged, but the butt of the second pistol came down hard against his temple. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain. He staggered, his vision blurring, the cries of his daughters sounding distant and distorted. Through the haze, he saw the man Silas Blackwood, he would later learn was his name. Snap the chain and hold the locket up to the light. Blackwood opened it, glanced at the portrait of Martha, and then back at the fallen Jedediah. A slow, cruel smile spread across his lips, visible even beneath the bandana. He wasn't just a thief. He was a messenger of a very personal torment. "A beautiful woman," Blackwood mused, his tone mocking. "She deserved better than a Morgan." He pocketed the locket, then motioned to his men. "We're done here." As they backed out of the bank, gunfire erupted into the street, a chaotic symphony of warning shots and returning fire from the hastily assembled townsfolk. Jedediah, struggling to his feet, blood trickling down his face, stumbled toward the door. He saw them leap onto their horses, Blackwood turning for one last look, his eyes locking with Jedediah's across the dusty street. It was a look of triumph, a promise of more to come. Jedediah's desperate, furious attempt to give chase ended as his legs gave out, and he collapsed in the doorway, the world fading to the sound of his daughters weeping his name. The robbery was over in minutes, but for Jedediah Morgan the war had just begun. He had lost more than a keepsake. A piece of his past had been stolen by a man who clearly intended to shatter his future. The Morgan Ranch was a sprawling testament to a legacy Jedediah no longer felt worthy of. It was a kingdom of grass and cattle, built by his father, Sheriff Elias Morgan, a man whose name was spoken with a reverence usually reserved for saints and legends. The main house, built of solid timber and stone, stood as a fortress against the harshness of the plains, but inside it was a hollow monument to grief. The silence was the loudest thing in it, a constant pressing weight that even the cheerful chatter of his daughters could not fully dispel. The sun beat down on the cracked earth, and the distant mesas shimmered like ghosts in the heat, mirroring the phantom of a life he once had. Jedediah sat at the heavy oak table his father had built, his head in his hands, the throbbing in his temple, a dull echo of the sharp, piercing loss in his heart. The locket was gone. It was just a thing, silver and glass. But it was the last piece of Martha he could touch, the last tangible proof of the light she had brought into his world. Blackwood hadn't stolen an object. He had stolen a ritual, the quiet moments each night when Jedediah would open it and whisper a memory to her face. His fists clenched. Rage was easier than grief. Rage was a fire that could cauterize a wound. Into this crucible of silence and sorrow walked Ilara, a woman who seemed as out of place in Redemption Creek as a rose in a desert. She had arrived a week before the robbery, a former governess from the East whose employers had fallen on hard times, leaving her stranded with little more than her wits and an unyielding spine. She was not beautiful in the delicate way Martha had been, but there was a strength in her clear, intelligent gaze and a resilience in the set of her jaw that the West had not yet managed to sand away. She had sought work, any work, and had been directed to the Morgan Ranch. The town whispered that Jedediah needed a housekeeper, a nanny, someone to fill the void Martha had left. Ilara, observing the dynamics of the town, with a sharp, discerning eye, saw not just a job, but a family drowning. She presented herself at his door, not with pity, but with a quiet professional competence that Jedediah, in his haze, found he could not refuse. Now she moved through his home with a gentle efficiency that slowly began to push back against the gloom. She did not try to replace Martha. The pictures on the mantelpiece remained untouched, the ghost of the former mistress of the house respected. Instead, she brought a new quiet order. She mended the girls' dresses, her stitches small and perfect. She coaxed laughter from Sarah and Emily, engaging their bright minds with stories and lessons that had them forgetting for a few hours a day that their world was fractured. She saw the raw pain in Jedediah, the paralysis that had seized him. She watched him stare out at the vast, empty horizon, a man trapped in his own legacy. His father's shadow loomed large over Redemption Creek, a legacy of unimpeachable justice. Yet Jedediah seemed to carry it not as a badge of honor, but as a burden. Ilara recognized the look of a man at war with himself, and she understood that the stolen locket was not just a piece of jewelry, but the catalyst that would force that war out into the open. The stakes were clear to her: Jedediah's soul, his family's future, and the encroaching darkness represented by Silas Blackwood. One evening, as Ilara was putting the girls to bed, she overheard Sarah ask her father a question in the hushed tones of a child venturing into forbidden territory. "Papa, are you going to get Mama's picture back?" Jedediah, who had been staring into the fire, his expression a mask of stone, flinched as if struck. He knelt beside his daughter's bed, his large calloused hand gently stroking her hair. His voice, when it came, was rough with unshed tears. "I will, sweetheart. I promise." Ilara, standing unseen in the shadows of the hallway, felt her heart ache for this broken family. She saw the promise for what it was, a vow made not just to a child, but to himself. A vow to climb out of the abyss of his grief and fight back. The quiet ranch, once a sanctuary of sorrow, was about to become the staging ground for a reckoning. A week after the robbery, a rider appeared on the horizon, a lone figure kicking up a plume of dust against the setting sun. He was a boy no older than 16, hired in the next town over, with a few coins and a sealed letter. He delivered it to Jedediah with a nervous glance, then spurred his horse and vanished as quickly as he'd appeared. The envelope was plain Jedediah's name scrawled across it in an elegant, deliberate hand. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the wax seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The message was short and the words, "A knife twisting in an open wound." Your father built his legacy on a lie. I'm here to collect the debt. Tucked into the fold of the paper was a single pressed flower. A prairie rose, the same delicate pink-blossomed flower Martha had painstakingly cultivated in a small garden by the porch. It was her favorite. The sight of it stole the air from Jedediah's lungs. This was an attack not only on his father's name, but on the sanctity of his wife's memory. It was a declaration that Blackwood knew him and knew his history, and was intent on dismantling it piece by piece. The carefully constructed dam of his grief shattered. A cold, clarifying rage surged through him, washing away the paralysis of the past year. He was no longer a man mourning a loss. He was a man defending a legacy and avenging a sacrilege. He stormed into Redemption Creek, the letter clutched in his fist, and burst into the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody, a cautious, weary man, who wore his badge like a penance, looked up from his paperwork, his expression one of tired resignation. "It's Blackwood Jedediah," said his voice a low growl. He slammed the letter down on the desk. He sent this. Brody read the note, his brow furrowing. He picked up the delicate flower and examined it with a practiced, dispassionate eye. Cryptic. Could mean anything. It means he's not done, Jedediah bit out. This isn't about the money he stole. He took Martha's locket for a reason. This letter, this is a threat against my family's name. Jedediah, listen to me. Brody said, his tone placating. Your father was a hero. His legacy is bedrock in this town. This is just some outlaw trying to get under your skin. He's taunting you, trying to draw you out. Don't take the bait. Let the law handle this. The law, Jedediah scoffed, gesturing around the small, dusty office. You have one deputy and a territory the size of a small state. Blackwood and his men were gone before the dust settled. You're not equipped to hunt them, and you know it. Riding out half-cocked will get you killed, Brody warned. And leave those 2 little girls of yours orphans. Think about them. I am thinking about them. Jedediah shot back, his voice tight with coiled fury. I'm thinking about the legacy I leave them. If I let a man like Blackwood tarnish my father's name and desecrate my wife's memory without a fight, what kind of man am I? The argument was going nowhere. Brody saw a grieving man, looking for a target. Jedediah saw a lawman shackled by procedure. As he turned to leave, his jaw set in grim determination, he nearly collided with Alara, who was standing just outside the doorway, a basket of supplies on her arm. She had seen the messenger ride to the ranch and had followed, a knot of worry tightening in her stomach. Her eyes met Jedediah's. She had clearly overheard the exchange. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a silent plea for caution. But then her gaze flickered to the pressed flower still lying on the sheriff's desk. That flower, she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the tension in the room. It's a prairie rose. They don't grow wild this far south. Not in this soil. They have to be cultivated, cared for. Both men turned to look at her. Brody raised an eyebrow, dismissive. But Jedediah understood. He looked at her, a flicker of appreciation in his eyes. She wasn't just offering a botanical fact, she was confirming the intimate, deliberate nature of the threat. Someone had to have taken that flower from Martha's garden. It meant Blackwood or one of his men had been to his ranch. They had walked on his land, stood by his home, and he had never known. The threat was not a distant shadow on the horizon. It was a viper coiled at his doorstep. He gave Alara a curt nod of gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of her sharp mind. Then he turned and walked out of the office, his purpose clear. Sheriff Brody could follow his books and procedures. Jedediah Morgan was going hunting. He wasn't just after a locket anymore. He was after the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. Jedediah was a rancher, not a tracker. He knew cattle trails and water sources, not the subtle art of pursuing men who wished to remain hidden. But rage was a powerful fuel, and it drove him into the Badlands, a desolate expanse of canyons and hoodoos, where the law was little more than a rumor. Whispers in a saloon had pointed him toward an old ghost town, Devil's Anvil, a place where outlaws were said to gather like vultures on a carcass. He rode for 2 days, the silence of the wilderness pressing in on him. He was a methodical man, and he approached the hunt with the same grim determination he applied to running his ranch. He rationed his water, rested his horse, and kept his rifle clean. But he was an amateur in a professional's world, and his every move felt heavy with uncertainty. The skills that made him a successful rancher, patience, foresight, and understanding of the land, were of little use when hunting predators of the two-legged variety. As he neared Devil's Anvil, the landscape grew more treacherous. The air was still and heavy, and the silence was unnerving. He dismounted, tethering his horse in a rocky alcove, and proceeded on foot, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. The ghost town was a collection of skeletal buildings, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at the unforgiving sun. A sense of unease crept over him. It was too quiet. He moved cautiously, using the crumbling walls for cover, his rifle held at the ready. He saw signs of recent occupation, a still warm fire pit, fresh horse droppings, a discarded whiskey bottle. They were here, or they had been. He crept toward the largest building, what looked to have been a saloon, its batwing doors hanging from a single hinge. He peered through a grimy window, and his heart hammered against his ribs. Inside, 3 men were playing cards around a rickety table. None of them was Blackwood. They were lean, hard-faced men, the kind who looked like they'd been born with a gun in their hand. He felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. His plan was simple, perhaps, foolishly so. Get the drop on them, force them to tell him where Blackwood was. He was a rancher, not a gunslinger, but he was strong, and desperation gave him an edge. He circled around to the back, found a warped door, and kicked it in. "Don't move," he yelled, leveling his rifle. The men reacted with terrifying speed. The card game was a ruse. In a blur of motion, the table was overturned, and all 3 men drew their pistols. The saloon erupted in a deafening roar of gunfire. Wood splintered around Jedediah as he dove for cover behind the bar. He fired back his shot, going wide. They were professionals, their movements economical and deadly. He was out of his depth. A bullet grazed his arm, searing a line of fire along his skin. Another slammed into the wood inches from his head. He realized his mistake with sickening clarity. He had walked into a trap. This wasn't Blackwood's main camp. It was an outpost, a line of defense left specifically to deal with anyone who came looking. He had to get out. He fired 2 more rounds toward the flashes of their guns, providing just enough cover to scramble backward out the door. He ran zigzagging between the derelict buildings as bullets whizzed past his ears, kicking up puffs of dust at his feet. He was a large target, clumsy in his haste, and he knew he wouldn't make it far. Just as he reached the edge of the town, a rifle shot cracked from a high window he hadn't seen. The bullet tore through his thigh. His leg buckled and he went down hard, the impact knocking the wind from him. Pain, sharp and blinding, shot up his leg. He tried to crawl to drag himself toward the rocks where his horse was hidden, but his vision was swimming. The three men emerged from the saloon, advancing on him slowly, their pistols aimed. This was the end. He thought of Sarah and Emily, their faces bright with laughter, and a wave of despair washed over him. He had failed them. He closed his eyes, waiting for the final shot. But it never came. Instead, he heard a sharp whistle, a signal from somewhere in the rocks above. The men stopped, looked at each other, and then reluctantly holstered their weapons. One of them spat on the ground near Jedediah's head. "Boss wants you alive," he grunted. "Says the lesson's not over yet." They turned and walked away, melting back into the shadows of the ghost town. Jedediah lay in the dust bleeding and defeated the cruel words hanging in the air. Blackwood hadn't wanted him dead. He wanted him broken. He wanted him to understand the chasm that separated them, the ruthless professional from the blundering amateur. Humbled and in agony, Jedediah dragged himself toward his horse, the first bitter taste of failure coating his tongue. He had survived the ambush, but he had lost the battle. Blackwood was not just a common outlaw. He was a phantom always one step ahead, and Jedediah realized with dawning horror that this was a game whose rules he did not yet understand. The ride back to Redemption Creek was a blur of pain and humiliation. Jedediah, humbled and wounded, understood now that brute force was a fool's errand. Blackwood was not a man to be hunted. He was a puzzle to be solved. The cryptic note was the key. "Your father built his legacy on a lie." The fight was not in the Badlands, but in the buried history of his own town, in the very foundation of his family's name. He began his investigation quietly, digging into the past with the tenacity of a man who had nothing left to lose. He spent hours in the dusty archives of the sheriff's office, poring over his father's old case files. Sheriff Elias Morgan's record was immaculate, a string of solved crimes and heroic deeds. The centerpiece of his career, the case that had cemented his legendary status, was the capture of the infamous Silver Creek Gang and the conviction of their supposed leader, a man named Elias Vance. The official story was simple. Vance was a ruthless outlaw, and Elias Morgan had brought him to justice, a triumph of law and order. But as Jedediah read through the journals his father had kept, he found inconsistencies. His father's handwriting, usually so firm and confident, was shaky and sparse in the entries surrounding Vance's trial. Details were omitted. Timelines seemed compressed. It felt less like a report of a clear-cut victory and more like a story someone was desperately trying to hold together. He sought out the town's old-timers men whose memories stretched back decades. Most simply parroted the legend they all knew. But one, a frail old prospector named Jebediah "Jeb" Stone, who lived in a shack at the edge of town, offered a different perspective. "Your father was a good man, Jedediah." Jeb said, his voice a dry rasp, but he was a practical man. He believed in the greater good of Redemption Creek. Sometimes that meant making hard choices. When Jedediah pressed him about Elias Vance, the old man grew quiet, his eyes clouding over. Vance wasn't like the others. He was quiet, had a wife and a young son. Didn't seem the type to lead a gang of killers. While Jedediah unearthed the ghosts of the past, Alara tended to the present. She had taken over the care of Sarah and Emily completely, her steady presence a balm on the fractured household. She saw the new grim focus in Jedediah, the way he pored over old documents late into the night, and she understood his quest had changed. It was no longer about a locket. It was about the truth. Her sharp, ordered mind proved to be an invaluable asset. One evening, as Jedediah struggled to make sense of a faded court transcript, Alara pointed to a name listed among the witnesses. Judge Sterling, she read aloud. He was the circuit judge who presided over the trial, wasn't he? He owns the Silver Ridge Mining Company now, the largest landowner in the county. Jedediah nodded. He built his fortune right after the Silver Creek gang was broken up. The land they supposedly used as a hideout turned out to have a rich silver vein. Alara's gaze was steady. That seems like a remarkable coincidence. Her insight was like a key turning a rusted lock. Jedediah started looking not just at his father's actions, but at who had benefited from them. He discovered that Judge Sterling had been a close friend of his father's, a partnership that had built Redemption Creek. Their interests were deeply intertwined. Their shared investigation forged a new bond between them, one built on mutual respect and a quiet, unspoken trust. She saw the honorable man beneath the layers of grief and anger. He saw a partner whose intelligence was matched only by her compassion. Meanwhile, Blackwood's torment continued a campaign of psychological warfare designed to isolate and break him. One morning, Jedediah found his ranch's main irrigation ditch sabotaged, threatening his herd with dehydration. Another day, rumors began to circulate in town, ugly whispers, that Jedediah's grief had driven him mad, that he was chasing shadows and neglecting his daughters. Some of the townsfolk who had once looked at him with pity now regarded him with suspicion. Blackwood was turning the community his father had protected against him. Each act was a calculated move, a piece being shifted on a board Jedediah was only just beginning to see. He was being herded toward a truth. He was not yet prepared to face a truth that Blackwood seemed determined to make him uncover for himself. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place in the dead of night. Tucked away in the back of his father's old roll-top desk, Jedediah found a hidden compartment. Inside was a small leather-bound ledger and a packet of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The ledger contained records of payments, large regular sums paid to his father by Judge Sterling's mining company for years following the Vance conviction. The letters were from Elias Vance's wife, written to Sheriff Morgan from a distant town after her husband had been sent to prison. They were not filled with threats, but with desperate, heartbreaking pleas for justice. She wrote of her husband's innocence of evidence, ignored of a man who was a simple prospector, not a gang leader. The last letter was a broken, grief-stricken note informing the sheriff that Elias Vance had died in prison of a lung infection, a forgotten man in a forgotten cell. And at the bottom she had written the name of the son he had left behind, Silas. Jedediah stared at the name, the blood draining from his face. Silas Blackwood. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a blood debt. He finally understood. Silas Blackwood was Elias Vance's son. The world tilted on its axis. The heroic legacy of his father, the bedrock of his entire life, crumbled into dust. Sheriff Elias Morgan, the paragon of justice, had not been a hero. He had been a conspirator. He had bent the law, condemned an innocent man, and destroyed a family to protect the town's most powerful interest, Judge Sterling and his silver mine. The Silver Creek gang had been real, but Elias Vance was a scapegoat, a convenient target whose land Sterling had coveted. His father had sacrificed an innocent man for the greater good, and had been paid handsomely for his sin. This revelation shattered Jedediah's identity. The quest for the locket, the righteous anger, the hunt for a villain, it all dissolved into a thick, choking fog of moral ambiguity. Silas Blackwood was not just a ruthless outlaw. He was a son seeking vengeance for a stolen legacy, for a father who died in disgrace. He was a dark mirror of Jedediah himself. The conflict was no longer a simple matter of good versus evil. It was a tangled web of lies, corruption, and generational pain. Who was the villain now, the man tearing the town apart with violence, or the men who had built the town on a foundation of deceit? Jedediah looked at his own hands and the hands of a Morgan, and for the first time in his life he felt the stain of a guilt that was not his own, but had been passed down to him like a cursed inheritance. His hunt for Blackwood had ended. Now he had to confront the sins of his father. Armed with the devastating truth, Jedediah knew his next fight was not with Blackwood, but with the man who still held Redemption Creek in his velvet-gloved fist. Judge Sterling was no longer a circuit judge. He was an aging patriarch, a pillar of the community, whose wealth and influence were woven into the very fabric of the town. He lived in a grand house on a hill overlooking the valley, a symbol of the prosperity built on a lie. Jedediah rode to the house, the ledger and letters tucked safely in his saddlebag. He found the judge on his veranda sipping brandy and watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Sterling was a man of impeccable appearance, with silver hair and eyes that held a lifetime of shrewd calculations. "Jedediah, my boy Sterling," said his voice smooth as polished wood. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Come have a drink." "I'm not here for a drink," Judge Jedediah said, his voice cold and even. He stood before him, a man stripped of his illusions. "I'm here about Elias Vance." The judge's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of something hard and dangerous passed through his eyes. "An old sad story. Your father's finest hour bringing that villain to justice." "He wasn't a villain," Jedediah stated, his gaze unwavering. "He was a prospector whose claim you wanted, and my father helped you get it." He laid it all out, the ledger, the letters, the inconsistencies. He spoke of Silas Blackwood and his campaign of revenge. Throughout it all, Judge Sterling listened with a serene, almost paternalistic calm. When Jedediah was finished, the judge took a slow sip of his brandy. "Your father was a pragmatist," Jedediah Sterling said, his tone shifting from friendly to menacingly frank. "He understood that for a town like ours to thrive, sacrifices were necessary. Elias Vance was a nobody. His life weighed against the prosperity and stability of hundreds. Well, the math is simple. Your father made the right choice. He secured the future of Redemption Creek. His legacy, and by extension yours, is this town's success." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let the past lie buried. This Blackwood is a mad dog. He deserves to be put down, of course. But digging up this old business will do nothing but destroy the foundations of everything we've built. It would tarnish your father's name, destabilize the town, and for what? To soothe the conscience of a dead man's son." The threat was clear, veiled in the language of friendly advice. Sterling was offering him a choice: become complicit in the lie and preserve his family's honor, or pursue the truth and risk destroying it all. He was being tested, asked to make the same corrupt bargain his father had made a generation ago. "The world is not a simple place of right and wrong," boy Sterling concluded, gesturing to the town below, now twinkling with lamplight. "It is a place of power and of men who are willing to wield it for the good of the many." Jedediah felt a profound sense of revulsion. He was now fighting on two fronts: against Blackwood's violent crusade for vengeance and against the deep-seated corruption that Sterling represented. He walked away from the judge's mansion with the weight of that choice pressing down on him. That night, he sat with Ilara by the fire, the evidence spread out on the table between them. He explained Sterling's offer, the terrible choice he faced. "If I expose him," Jedediah said, his voice heavy, "I destroy my father's memory. The town will see him as a fraud. My daughters will grow up with the name Morgan, meaning corruption. But if I stay silent, I'm no better than he was. I'm letting Blackwood's rampage continue, and I'm validating the lie that killed his father." Ilara listened patiently, her expression filled with a deep, empathetic understanding. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her touch was warm, steady. "Your father's legacy is not who he was, Jedediah," she said softly. "It's who you are. What you do now, that is what will define the name Morgan for your daughters. You are not bound by his mistakes. You have a choice to make things right." Her words were a beacon in his confusion. She was his moral compass, reminding him that true honor wasn't found in protecting a flawless reputation, but in having the courage to face a flawed truth. He looked at her, at the strength and integrity in her eyes, and knew what he had to do. He would not protect the lie. He would pursue justice no matter the cost. His war was no longer just with Blackwood or Sterling. It was a war for his own soul. A fierce thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains, turning the sky a bruised purple and unleashing a torrent of rain that turned the dusty streets of Redemption Creek to mud. It was on this night that Blackwood made his final, desperate move. A frantic ranch hand burst into the house, his face pale with terror. Blackwood and his men had stormed the north pastures, setting fire to a hay barn as a diversion. In the chaos, they had taken Emily. A note was left pinned to the stable door, a single chilling sentence. "The old silver mine. Come alone. The debt will be paid." Jedediah's blood ran cold. This was it. The final confrontation in the very place where the town's corrupt prosperity had been born. He strapped on his gun belt, his movements grim and deliberate. Ilara rushed to his side, her face a mask of fear and resolve. "You cannot go alone," she pleaded. "I have to," he said, his voice raw. "This is between him and me. It's a debt between our fathers." He looked at her, his eyes conveying everything he could not say. "Look after Sarah." The abandoned Silver Ridge mine was a gaping maw in the side of the mountain, a place of ghosts and forgotten histories. Lantern light flickered weakly against the oppressive darkness within. As Jedediah entered, the rumble of thunder overhead echoed through the tunnels like the groans of a dying beast. Dripping water was the only other sound. He found them in the main chamber, a vast cavern supported by rotting timber beams. Emily was tied to a support pillar, her small face streaked with tears, but her eyes defiant, a spark of her father in her. Blackwood stood beside her, his pistol resting lightly on her shoulder. He was no longer wearing a bandana. His face was intelligent, handsome, but etched with a grief so profound it had curdled into fanaticism. "Welcome, Morgan Blackwood," said his voice echoing in the cavern. "Welcome to the tomb your father built for mine." "Let her go, Blackwood Jedediah," said his hand hovering over his own pistol. "Your fight is with me." "My fight is with the lie your name represents." Blackwood retorted, his eyes burning with a zealot's fire. "My father, Elias Vance, was a good man. He trusted your father. He thought the law was a shield for the innocent. Your father taught him it was a hammer for the powerful. He died in a cage, coughing his lungs out, his name a curse, while your father grew old a hero. The battle that followed was not just one of bullets, but of ideologies. As they circled each other in the dim, claustrophobic space, Blackwood laid out the full, agonizing story of his family's suffering. He spoke of a childhood spent in poverty and shame, of a mother who died of a broken heart. "I am not just here for revenge," he snarled, his voice cracking with emotion. "I am here for justice. The justice your father denied mine." Then came the final devastating blow. Blackwood reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn diary. "Recognize this. It belonged to your wife." Jedediah froze. It was Martha's journal, the one he had thought lost in the fire, that had claimed the old storage shed a few months before her death. She was a good woman, your Martha. Blackwood said, a strange note of sorrow in his voice. Smarter than you knew. She found your father's ledger. She had a conscience he lacked. She found me. She was horrified by what your family had done to mine. He opened the journal to a marked page. She was going to help me. She was going to help me expose Sterling and clear my father's name. We were going to bring the truth to light together. He looked up, his eyes boring into Jedediah's. And then she had her accident. A runaway wagon, they said. How very convenient for Judge Sterling, don't you think? The world fractured. Jedediah's grief for his wife was suddenly twisted into a new horrific shape. Had her death not been a random tragedy? Was it another casualty of the lie, another life sacrificed to protect Sterling's empire? The possibility, the sheer soul-crushing horror of it, nearly brought him to his knees. Blackwood saw his advantage and lunged. But in that moment of ultimate despair, Jedediah's purpose became diamond-sharp. This was no longer about his father's sins or Blackwood's pain. It was about his daughter, about the future, about saving the last piece of his world from being consumed by the past. The ensuing fight was a desperate, brutal affair. Gunshots ricocheted off the rock walls. They grappled in the mud and darkness, two men forged in the same fire of generational injustice. Jedediah was stronger, but Blackwood was faster, fueled by a lifetime of rage. But Jedediah was not fighting for revenge. He was fighting for a life. He used his mind, not just his muscle. He kicked over a lantern, plunging one side of the cavern into darkness. He used the echoes to disorient Blackwood, the knowledge of the mine's layout gleaned from old maps during his investigation to his advantage. He led Blackwood toward a notoriously unstable side tunnel. As thunder cracked directly overhead, the mine shuddered, raining dust and pebbles from the ceiling. Jedediah dove for his daughter, cutting her ropes with his knife, just as Blackwood charged again. Jedediah shoved Emily behind him and stood his ground. But instead of firing, he kicked out a central support beam that was already groaning under the strain. With a terrible shriek of stressed wood and shifting rock, the tunnel behind Blackwood began to collapse. Blackwood turned his eyes wide with shock as tons of rock and earth came crashing down. He was buried in an instant, a poetic end for a man who had spent his life digging up the past. Justice, in its own brutal way, had been served. Jedediah grabbed his daughter, holding her tight, and scrambled out of the mine just as the main entrance began to crumble behind them, sealing the cavern and its dark secrets forever. He stood in the pouring rain, clutching his weeping child, a man who had faced the ghosts of two families and had by a thread survived. In the gray light of dawn, Jedediah returned to Redemption Creek, not as a conqueror, but as a man bearing a heavy truth. He carried a sleeping Emily in his arms, her small body a warm, living weight against his chest. He did not go to his ranch. He walked directly to the town hall where the council was already gathering, alerted by Sheriff Brody to the events at the mine. With Alara standing silently by his side for support, Jedediah laid his father's ledger and Elias Vance's letters on the council table. He spared no one, least of all his own family. He told them the whole story of Judge Sterling's greed, of his father's complicity, of the innocent man who paid the price, and of the son whose quest for justice had curdled into violent revenge. He did not hide the truth. He held it up to the light, letting its ugliness be seen by all. The town was thrown into turmoil. The revelation that their prosperity was built on a crime and that their legendary sheriff was a flawed man shook Redemption Creek to its core. Judge Sterling, summoned before the council, denied everything with blustering indignation, but the evidence in the ledger was undeniable. His empire crumbled, his reputation shattered. Stripped of his power and influence, he became a pariah, a ghost, haunting the grand house on the hill. The aftermath was messy. Some townsfolk resented Jedediah for tarnishing a hallowed memory and disrupting their comfortable world. They called him a traitor to his own blood. But others, a quiet majority, looked at him with a newfound respect. They saw a man who had chosen painful honesty over a comfortable lie, a man who had risked everything for integrity. Days later, Jedediah and Alara sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sun set. The silence between them was no longer one of grief or uncertainty, but of peace and understanding. "I keep thinking about Martha, Jedediah," said his voice quiet, "wondering if Blackwood was telling the truth. If she died for knowing—" "You may never know for certain," Alara replied, her voice gentle. "But you know what she was trying to do. She was trying to make things right, and you've honored that. You've finished what she started." He looked at her, at the woman who had stood by him, who had become his compass and his strength. In her eyes, he saw not the ghost of a past love, but the promise of a new future. He was finally able to grieve Martha not as a perfect saint in a locket, but as the brave, complex woman she truly was. And he was finally able to grieve for his father, not the legend, but the flawed man who had made a terrible mistake. The weight of his legacy had been lifted, replaced by the lighter, stronger burden of his own choices. Months later, a new normal had settled over the Morgan Ranch. The fields were green, the cattle were healthy, and the sound of children's laughter once again filled the house without the echo of sorrow. Jedediah was no longer a man living in the shadow of his father. He was building a legacy of his own, one founded on truth and hard work. He and Alara had forged a true partnership, a quiet love built on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. One clear, cool afternoon, Jedediah took his daughters and Alara to the small cemetery on the hill where Martha was buried. The simple wooden headstone stood beneath a sprawling oak tree. For a long time, he just stood there, his hat in his hands. He no longer carried his father's old sheriff's badge. He had given it to the town museum, a relic of a complicated past. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket which he had recovered from the rubble at the entrance to the mine. It was dented and scratched, but the portrait of Martha inside was unharmed. He didn't open it. Instead, he gently hung it over the corner of the headstone, leaving it to catch the afternoon sun. Then he reached out and took Alara's hand, his fingers lacing through hers. As they turned to walk away, Sarah looked up at him, her expression serious. "Papa," she asked, her small voice carrying on the breeze, "was Grandpa Elias a good man?" Jedediah stopped and knelt down so he was eye level with his daughter. He looked from her curious face to Alara's warm smile, and he felt a sense of peace settle over him, profound and complete. "He was a man who made mistakes," Jedediah said, his voice clear and steady. "Just like all of us. What matters is what we do to make things right."